there exists a form of being that cannot be separated, cannot be labeled, cannot be compared. That is the state of pure aloneness. Not loneliness, something born from feelings of abandonment, separation, or a lack of recognition. True aloneness is not a result of circumstances, but rather an original state, where the ego no longer exists as a center to resist or control. Loneliness is a reaction of the mind when it loses its object of attachment, whether people, memories, positions, images. Meanwhile, aloneness is not a deficiency, but completeness. Not sadness, but profound silence. It needs nothing to become fulfilled because it is already whole. When a person is truly alone, there is no more inner conflict, no one left to become, no model to reach. What remains is a soft, sensitive, and flexible way of living. It is not bound by memory or expectation, not limited by space or time. And precisely because it is not formatted, it becomes sustainable, like water without shape but able to flow through any terrain. Only in that state can consciousness communicate with the nameless, where there is no beginning and no end. A life beyond logic and language, where all causes dissolve and only what is remains, pure, vast, unconditional. For one who is truly alone, there is no longer a concept of death, because death only exists for the ego, which is framed within time. When the ego is no more, then life is no longer fragmented into cycles of birth and death. It simply is, needing no destination, starting from no origin. Such aloneness needs no affirmation through any form. It is not isolation, but the dissolution of all barriers. Not disconnection, but connection from within to the whole. Not through words, not through thoughts, only through pure presence. And because nothing creates it, nothing can destroy it. It cannot be terminated, cannot be hurt, cannot be manipulated. True aloneness is immortal, not in a religious or mystical sense, but in the clearest way. It was never born and therefore cannot die. When touching that state, you no longer seek light elsewhere, because you are the light. You no longer ask, "Who am I?" because there is no I left to search for. Only presence remains, no witness, no object being witnessed, but life in itself. Practical guidelines for living in pure existence across all daily contexts. Morning awakening practice. The moment consciousness emerges from sleep presents the purest opportunity to establish connection with original being. Before the mind begins its habitual pattern of planning, worrying, or reviewing, there exists a brief window where awareness is fresh and uncontaminated by psychological accumulation. Instead of immediately reaching for your phone or rushing into mental activity, remain still and observe the quality of consciousness as it naturally unfolds. This is not meditation in the traditional sense of concentration or technique, but simply allowing awareness to be aware of itself without direction or goal. Notice how thoughts begin to form like clouds in an empty sky, but do not engage with their content or try to stop them. The key is to remain as the space in which all mental activity occurs, rather than identifying with any particular thought or feeling that arises. This morning practice establishes a foundation of inner stillness that can be accessed throughout the day, regardless of external circumstances or challenges. When you eventually rise and begin your daily activities, carry this quality of spacious awareness with you, allowing it to inform how you move, speak, and interact with your environment. The transition from lying down to standing, from silence to activity, becomes a seamless flow rather than an abrupt shift from peace to agitation, transforming routine activities into presence practice. Every mundane task throughout the day offers an invitation to deepen into present moment awareness and dissolve the artificial separation between spiritual practice and ordinary living. When brushing teeth, washing dishes, or preparing meals, Instead of allowing the mind to wander into future planning or past reviewing, bring complete attention to the sensory experience of the activity itself. Feel the texture of the toothbrush against your gums, the temperature of the water, the taste of the toothpaste, without labeling these sensations as pleasant or unpleasant. This is not about forcing concentration, but about naturally allowing attention to rest in immediate experience rather than mental commentary about experience. When washing dishes, notice the weight of each plate, the sound of water flowing, the feeling of soap between your fingers, the visual patterns of light reflecting off wet surfaces. These simple activities become doorways into deeper presence when approached with genuine interest and attention rather than mechanical habit. The key insight is that consciousness is not separate from these activities. You're not a separate observer watching yourself wash dishes, but rather the entire field of awareness in which the activity of dishwashing is spontaneously occurring. This understanding gradually dissolves the sense of being a separate self doing things and reveals the seamless unity of awareness and activity. Through this practice, ordinary life becomes extraordinary not because anything external changes, but because the quality of attention brings forth the inherent aliveness and intelligence present in every moment, navigating interpersonal relationships from wholeness. Human relationships often become sources of psychological conflict because we approach them from a foundation of incompleteness, seeking validation, security, or identity through others. When operating from true aloneness, that state of inner completeness, relationships transform from transactions of need into expressions of natural love and understanding. This does not mean becoming emotionally distant or detached, but rather engaging with others from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. When someone speaks to you, instead of immediately formulating your response or defending your position, listen with your entire being, not just to their words, but to the quality of consciousness behind their words. Often what people are really communicating is not the surface content of their speech, but their underlying emotional state, their unspoken needs, their unconscious fears or desires. When you listen from this deeper level, your responses naturally arise from wisdom and compassion rather than reactive patterns or ego-driven agendas. If conflict arises in conversation, instead of immediately taking sides or defending your viewpoint, pause and observe the energy of conflict itself. Notice how the mind wants to be right, wants to win, wants to maintain its position, and see if it's possible to remain present to this energy without being consumed by it. This doesn't mean becoming passive or allowing others to mistreat you, but rather responding from clarity and strength rather than emotional reactivity. When you speak from this place of inner stillness, your words carry a different quality. They are more precise, more truthful, more effective in actually communicating what needs to be expressed. Relationships become opportunities for mutual recognition of our shared humanity rather than battlegrounds for competing egos, working with difficult emotions and psychological states. Traditional approaches to emotional healing often involve analyzing, processing, or trying to change our emotional states. But true transformation occurs through a different kind of relationship with our inner experience. When strong emotions arise, whether anger, sadness, fear, or anxiety, instead of immediately trying to fix or escape them, experiment with remaining present to the raw energy of the emotion without the story that usually accompanies it. For example, when anger arises, notice the physical sensations in your body. The heat, the tension, the increased heart rate, without immediately engaging with the mental narrative about who or what caused the anger. This is not suppression or denial, but rather a more direct and intimate relationship with your actual experience. Often we suffer not from the emotion itself, but from our resistance to the emotion, our judgments about having the emotion, or our identification with the emotion as defining who we are. When you can remain present to the pure energy of an emotional state without these secondary layers of mental commentary, the emotion is free to move through your system naturally without becoming stuck or creating psychological residue. This approach requires tremendous gentleness and patience with yourself, as it goes against the mind's habitual tendency to either indulge in emotional drama or push away uncomfortable feelings. The key insight is that emotions are not problems to be solved, but rather expressions of life energy that arise and pass away naturally when not interfered with by mental resistance or attachment. Through this practice, you develop what could be called emotional intelligence, not the ability to control or manipulate your emotions, but the capacity to remain present and responsive rather than reactive regardless of what emotional weather is moving through your inner landscape. Creating sacred space in ordinary environments. The quality of presence you bring to any environment is more important than the external conditions of that environment in determining whether it becomes a space for awakening or a source of distraction and agitation. Whether you are in a busy office, a crowded subway, or a chaotic household, it is possible to establish an inner sanctuary that remains undisturbed by external circumstances. This is not about creating physical isolation or trying to control your environment, but about recognizing that peace and stillness are not dependent on external conditions, but rather on the quality of consciousness you embody. When entering any space, take a moment to consciously connect with your breath and establish your presence before engaging with the activities or people in that environment. This simple practice creates what could be called a field of awareness that influences not only your own experience, but often the experience of others around you. Notice how your state of consciousness affects the energy of a room. When you're truly present and at peace, others often become more relaxed and centered in your presence, even if they are not consciously aware of what is happening. This is not about trying to influence others or taking responsibility for their emotional states, but simply recognizing the natural transmission that occurs when consciousness is clear and undisturbed. In challenging environments, instead of becoming agitated or resistant, use the difficulty as an opportunity to deepen your practice of remaining present regardless of circumstances. The noise, chaos, or negativity around you becomes like weather, something that is occurring in your field of awareness but does not fundamentally disturb your essential nature. Through this practice, you discover that you can maintain inner peace and clarity in any situation, which is true spiritual freedom. Sleep and rest as spiritual practice. The transition into sleep offers a unique opportunity to explore the dissolution of the ego mind and the return to undifferentiated consciousness. Instead of falling asleep unconsciously while watching television or scrolling through your phone, create a conscious transition into rest that honors the sacred nature of this daily death and rebirth. As you lie down and prepare for sleep, take time to consciously release the events and concerns of the day, not by analyzing or processing them, but by simply allowing them to dissolve back into the silence from which they arose. Notice how thoughts and worries lose their grip on your attention as the body naturally relaxes and consciousness begins to withdraw from sensory engagement with the external world. This is not about forcing sleep or trying to control the process, but about remaining aware and present as consciousness naturally transforms from its waking state into deeper levels of rest. If you experience insomnia or difficulty sleeping, instead of becoming frustrated or anxious, use this as an opportunity to explore the nature of consciousness itself. Lie in bed with complete acceptance of being awake, without any agenda to fall asleep, and simply observe the play of thoughts, sensations, and awareness in the darkness. Often the resistance to being awake is what creates the suffering associated with insomnia, not the lack of sleep itself. When you can rest in awareness itself, whether asleep or awake, the body receives the restoration it needs and the mind finds the peace it seeks. Upon waking, instead of immediately jumping into mental activity or reaching for external stimulation, remain still for a few moments and notice the quality of consciousness as it emerges from the depths of sleep. This daily practice of conscious sleeping and waking gradually reveals the continuity of awareness that underlies all states of consciousness, leading to a deeper understanding of your true nature beyond the fluctuations of waking and sleeping states. Eating and nourishment as conscious practice. The act of eating presents one of the most immediate and intimate opportunities to practice presence and dissolve the artificial separation between spiritual awareness and physical existence. Most people eat unconsciously, either rushing through meals while distracted by screens and conversations, or using food as emotional comfort or escape from present moment discomfort. When you approach eating from a state of true aloneness and presence, the simple act of nourishing your body becomes a profound meditation on the interconnectedness of all life. Before eating, take a moment to acknowledge the journey that brought this food to your plate, the soil, water, and sunlight that nurtured its growth, the hands that planted and harvested it, the complex web of relationships that made this meal possible. This is not intellectual gratitude, but a felt recognition of your participation in the vast web of existence. As you begin eating, slow down enough to actually taste your food, to feel its texture, to notice how your body responds to different flavors and nutrients. Chew slowly and completely, allowing the process of digestion to begin in your mouth rather than rushing food into your stomach. Notice the tendency of the mind to wander while eating, planning the next activity, reviewing past events, or judging the food as good or bad. Instead of following these mental movements, gently return attention to the immediate sensory experience of eating. This practice gradually transforms your relationship with food from unconscious consumption to conscious nourishment, and often naturally leads to healthier eating patterns without the need for rigid diets or external rules. When you eat from presence rather than compulsion or habit, your body's natural intelligence guides you toward the foods and quantities that truly serve your well-being. The act of eating becomes a celebration of life rather than a mechanical refueling, and meals become opportunities for deeper communion with the life force that sustains all existence. Movement and physical exercise as embodied awareness. Physical movement offers a direct pathway to embodied presence and the dissolution of the mind-body split that characterizes most people's relationship with their physical form. Whether walking, running, practicing yoga, or engaging in any form of exercise, the key is to move from awareness rather than from the ego's agenda of achieving, competing, or improving. When you walk, instead of walking to get somewhere while your mind is elsewhere, walk as an expression of presence itself. Feel your feet making contact with the ground. Notice the rhythm of your breathing. Observe how your body naturally balances and adjusts with each step. This is not about walking slowly or in any particular way, but about being fully present to the miracle of movement as it unfolds. If you run or engage in more vigorous exercise, use the intensity of physical exertion as an opportunity to transcend the mind's usual commentary and drop into pure bodily awareness. Notice how the ego mind often creates stories about discomfort, fatigue, or performance, and experiment with remaining present to the raw sensations of physical intensity without these mental overlays. Often what we call pain or discomfort is actually just intense sensation that becomes suffering only when filtered through mental resistance and judgment. When you can remain present to physical sensation without the mind's interpretation, exercise becomes a form of moving meditation that integrates body and consciousness rather than treating the body as a machine to be optimized. This approach to movement naturally leads to greater physical health and vitality. Not because you're forcing your body to conform to external standards, but because you're allowing your body's innate intelligence to guide and inform your physical activity. Your body knows how to move, how to heal, how to find balance. When you get out of the way with mental interference and trust the wisdom of embodied awareness. Work and career as expression of being. Most people experience work as something they must do to survive, often feeling trapped in jobs that drain their energy and separate them from their authentic nature. When operating from true aloneness and inner completeness, work transforms from external obligation to natural expression of your unique gifts and capacities. This doesn't necessarily mean changing careers or pursuing only work that feels personally fulfilling, but rather bringing a different quality of presence and attention to whatever work you find yourself doing. Whether you're answering phones, teaching children, building houses, or managing a business, the key is to engage with your work as an opportunity to express consciousness through form rather than as a burden to be endured. When you approach tasks from presence rather than resistance, even mundane work activities become opportunities for creativity, service, and the expression of intelligence. Notice how the mind creates stories about work, that it's boring, meaningless, beneath you, or preventing you from doing what you really want to do. These mental narratives are what creates suffering around work, not the work activities themselves. When you can engage with work tasks without these mental overlays, you often discover unexpected satisfaction and effectiveness in activities you previously found tedious or frustrating. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting poor working conditions, but rather responding to work challenges from clarity and wisdom rather than emotional reactivity or victim consciousness. If changes in your work situation are needed, they arise naturally from this place of inner clarity rather than from desperate attempts to escape your current circumstances. Your work becomes a vehicle for contributing to the world's well-being rather than just a means of personal survival. And you discover that you can maintain inner peace and authenticity regardless of external work pressures or demands. Money and material possessions as neutral energy. Our relationship with money and material possessions often reveals deep, unconscious patterns of fear, desire, and identity that keep us trapped in cycles of psychological suffering. When approached from the perspective of true aloneness and inner completeness, money becomes neither good nor evil, but simply a form of energy that can be used skillfully or unskillfully, depending on the consciousness behind its use. Many people swing between extremes of either obsessing over money and accumulating possessions as a source of security and identity, or rejecting money and material comfort as somehow unspiritual or corrupting. Both approaches miss the deeper truth that money and possessions are neutral. They take on the quality of consciousness that engages with them. When you no longer seek identity, security, or happiness through material accumulation, you can engage with money and possessions from practical wisdom rather than compulsive need. This might mean earning and spending money in ways that align with your values and contribute to collective well-being, or it might mean living more simply and discovering the freedom that comes from needing less. The key insight is that true security and fulfillment cannot be found through external accumulation. But this understanding frees you to engage with money and possessions more skillfully rather than being driven by unconscious fears and desires. When making financial decisions, instead of operating from anxiety about the future or comparing yourself to others, tune into your body's wisdom and inner knowing about what truly serves your well-being and the well-being of others. Often the most economically sound decisions are also the most aligned with deeper values and long-term sustainability. This approach to money and possessions naturally leads to greater abundance, not necessarily in terms of accumulating more things, but in terms of feeling genuinely prosperous and generous regardless of your external financial circumstances, dealing with illness and physical challenges. When the body experiences illness, injury, or chronic health challenges, it presents a powerful opportunity to deepen your understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical form. Most people relate to illness as an enemy to be fought or a problem to be solved, which often creates additional layers of psychological suffering on top of whatever physical discomfort is present. When approached from true aloneness and acceptance, illness becomes a teacher that reveals the impermanent nature of all physical phenomena and the unchanging awareness that witnesses all bodily states. This doesn't mean becoming passive about healthcare or ignoring medical treatment, but rather maintaining inner peace and presence regardless of what is happening with your physical body. When experiencing pain or discomfort, instead of immediately trying to escape or fix the sensation, experiment with remaining present to the raw experience of physical sensation without the mental story about what it means or how long it will last. Often physical pain becomes exponentially more difficult when we add mental resistance, fear about the future, or identification with the pain as defining who we are. When you can remain present to physical sensation as simply sensation, neither good nor bad, just what is arising in this moment, the body's natural healing intelligence is free to operate without interference from mental anxiety and resistance. This approach often leads to faster healing and greater resilience. Not because you're doing anything special, but because you're not adding unnecessary psychological stress to whatever physical challenge is present. If chronic illness or disability is part of your life experience, this practice can transform your relationship with physical limitation from victimhood to acceptance, and sometimes even to gratitude for the way challenges can deepen wisdom and compassion. Your essential nature, pure awareness, is never sick, never injured, never diminished by whatever happens to the physical body, and recognizing this truth provides an unshakable foundation of peace that no external circumstances can disturb. Aging and death as natural transitions. In cultures that worship youth and deny the reality of aging and death, growing older often becomes a source of anxiety, depression, and desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of permanent physical form. When living from true aloneness and understanding of your essential nature, aging becomes a natural and even beautiful process of consciousness gradually releasing its identification with physical form. This doesn't mean neglecting physical health or becoming morbid about mortality, but rather embracing the entire life cycle as a sacred journey of awakening. As the body ages and physical capacities change, instead of mourning what is lost or fighting against natural processes, you can discover the gifts that come with each stage of life. The wisdom earned through experience, the freedom that comes from caring less about others' opinions, the deepening capacity for presence that often accompanies the slowing down of physical activity. When facing your own mortality or the death of loved ones, instead of being overwhelmed by grief or terror, you can rest in the recognition that what you truly are, pure consciousness, was never born and therefore cannot die. The forms that consciousness takes, including your physical body and personality, are temporary expressions that arise and pass away like waves on the ocean. But the ocean itself is eternal and unchanging. This understanding doesn't eliminate the natural human emotions that arise around loss and change, but it provides a foundation of peace that allows you to experience grief, sadness, or fear without being destroyed by these emotions. Death becomes not an ending, but a transition, not a failure, but a completion, not something to be feared, but something to be approached with curiosity and even gratitude for the opportunity to discover what lies beyond the boundaries of individual existence. When you are no longer afraid of death, you become truly free to live with complete authenticity and presence, knowing that your essential nature is indestructible and eternal.